Hello everyone, it's Olivia here, aka Stream Minded, and I thought I'd just make this video for the final sort of uni assignments I've done so far for my first year, because then I'll be up to date with them. I tried to make this video yesterday, but I kept failing with the camera and other sort of malfunctions. So this was for my literature module, Unpacking Texts, which is all to do with like literature theory and lots of stuff that just sort of goes way over my head, but I gave it my best shot. This was the assignment I had to do over Christmas, and it was an experience, let's just call it that. So I'm not going to bore you with the amount of questions we could have picked from, but the question I went for in the end was, with reference to relevant theoretical material, which is basically our Norton anthology that we were using on the course, consider in what ways binary oppositions are constructed, critiqued or blurred in one literary text that you have studied on this unit. And this was like completely independent study. We could have picked from 3 of our primary texts, and they were Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, which I read over the summer before I actually started uni, Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, or the one I went for because I absolutely fell in love with it. I read it in like 2 days and I just loved it, George Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo. And the theoretical material, we have this, anyone who sort of studies English at uni or stuff, you will probably encounter the Norton anthology. You have like all the different Norton anthologies of literature, but then there's also a Norton anthology of theory and criticism, and that's like a massive book full of like theoretical essays and scholars and wise people that probably know way more than I do about literature. So that's what that part was. So yeah, the reason why I sort of went for this question was because there was something familiar that I actually understood. All the other questions I was like, don't like that, don't like that, don't like that. But I saw binary oppositions and I was like, something that I understand. So I was really happy when that question came up. And I went to my sort of, before I did this, I went to a tutorial with my lecturer before the Christmas holidays, winter break, and I was like, you know, just this is what I'm thinking of. Am I on the right tracks? Help. And he really helped me to refine my idea with the idea of like the presence and absence. And as soon as he sort of started talking about that, it just clicked. And that was like, I realised that is what I was trying to say. And I realised that is the kind of line I was going for. But he just helped me refine my idea. And I was like, thank you. Yes, I can roll with this now. And yeah, like I mentioned before, sorry, I wrote these all down in notes because otherwise I kept trying to look at my Word document, but then my camera would cut out. So this is what I've had to do. Sorry, I heard a really weird noise then. It's my cat, I think, outside my room having a wash by the sounds of it. I was like, what is that? Coming up the stairs. So independent study, Norton anthology. So I went for Wolfgang Iser, who was, we had the choice, we could use anything from the Norton anthology. We only had to do one, that was the only brief. We only had to include at least one, and then any other research we wanted to do around it. I personally went for one of the theorists we had talked about a little bit because it tied in nicely with what I wanted to talk about. So I went for Wolfgang Iser's interaction between text and the reader. So for my introduction, I sort of did an Oxford English Dictionary definition of what binary was and what oppositions was, and just sort of combined them together just to sort of show this is what they are. And then I talked about how my essay was going to talked about what my essay was going to show. So I talked about like what constructs oppositions, like binary oppositions, and I mentioned I was going to talk about presence, absence, and polyvocality. And polyvocality is multiple voices in a narrative text. And then I've also included in my introduction how I was also going to apply Iser's sort of theory and with a particular focus on preconceptions and the explicit and implicit. So for paragraph 1, I talked about the idea of presence and absence being like this overseeing binary opposition throughout the text. And I sort of looked at, in Lincoln in the Bardo, Willie is Lincoln's son, and he dies of fever, and in real life he died of fever. And the settings themselves are a binary opposition, because Willie is upstairs dying with a fever, his parents are downstairs hosting this party, so the setting themselves immediately construct a binary opposition. But then I talked about the idea of how these are blurred, because the separation becomes blurred because rich notes came to the sick room is one of the quotes I used, and so like the music from downstairs is travelling up to him. And I talked about the idea of absence with, like, even though Willie himself is absent from the party, his senses cannot be withdrawn from it. And then there was a parallel I found with his parents. They're downstairs in the party, but obviously their thoughts are with his son, and it's really creepy because there's this really implicit use of the lyrics, where it's, oh God, it is fearful to perish by fire. And I discovered that this mirrors like an earlier description of his handsome round face inflamed with fever. And this might be a little bit far-fetched, but I decided to use it anyway. A single page separates these details, so I thought that presented like a literal blurring in the text. Like, there's literally these two details, there's literally just a page separating them, and yet it's all blurred and coming together. And then I linked in, at the end of this paragraph, I linked in Iza's, his idea of the implicit and explicit. So the lyrics and Willie's fragile existence is implicitly implied through the song lyrics, but then it's explicit for Willie because the rich notes are in his room, and it's this like consistent transition between the two, that absent becomes the present. And then I talked about the idea of this, it establishes this life and death crossover for like a binary opposition. Then paragraph 2, I went on to talk about Iza's preconceptions, and this is where I examined the sick room idea a bit further, because one of the ghosts, Hans Vollmann, early on in this, like literally in the first chapter, he talks about his sick box, and Iza's theory is all to do with how we as readers interact with the text. So I talked about how this familiarity can allow us to engage with it, and like Willie is most likely going to join Hans Vollmann. And I also linked in another part of Iza's theory where it talks about gaps arising out of dialogue stimulates the reader into filling in the blanks with projections. So I linked that idea with Bardo is only in the title, and unless you research it, most readers aren't likely to know what Bardo means. And I can't remember if it's a Tibetan word from what I looked at. I didn't actually include this in my essay because word count restrictions, but I think it's like this kind of limbo, like this in-between states of life and death, and sort of like you're dead but you're transitioning. It's like an afterlife, kind of, you're stuck in limbo. And I sort of just tied that in and talked about the idea that it's like the blanks offer another opportunity for readers to interact. Then on paragraph 3, I further looked at the binary opposition of life and death that I talked about in paragraph 1, and I focused on the idea of the critique part of the question. So this is where I start to talk about the text structure and polyvocality and the blur of the explicit implicit once again. So you have like a piggish and excessive display in a time of war, is what one of the guests says about the party. But then another guest is like, what generosity, how kind, our dear host. So that's very explicit. They explicitly state their like views. But then on the other hand, I also talked about how it's the subtle delivery of in the party with the food. There's this sugar work, and it just says a warship, a temple of liberty, and they're just like subtly put next to each other in a list. And I talked about the idea that this irony, it draws the reader's attention to it, because these two icons shouldn't be next to each other, and yet they are. And then at the end of this paragraph, I linked in a reviewer I found to back up my polyvocality concept and Iza's theory. And the part of Iza's theory I included here was he believes we never learn from the text how accurate or inaccurate our views are of it, because we can never know. Then for paragraph 4, I did about absence. I went on to a new idea, and I talked about the absence of understanding and the presence of a rigid belief system. And I talked about how this is constructed by the ghost entrapment within their individual constructs of time. So like, Mr. Lincoln was president, how could it be? And then I linked in Lieutenant Cecil Stone and his absence of understanding, because he's a slave owner and he's a horrible character. I hated his character. And he explicitly expresses racist views, which was the norm of his society. And then I linked in Iza's theory of our perception of, I think I linked in Isa's idea of preconceptions at the end, but I also found a different theory about perception of others and tied it in. And it's like the lieutenant is really violent, and I used like lots of quotes and stuff to show it, but he becomes a mirror image of this. He despises his slaves, and yet he views them as being barbaric, but he's barbaric to them, so he becomes a mirror image of what he like hates. And that's the idea of reader blanks again. And that's, even though he's got the title of lieutenant, we never learn about that. All we see him as is a slave owner, and his identity is dependent on that. So that's kind of what I talked about. And then for my last paragraph, paragraph 5, I talked about polyvocality critiques and blurs once again. And it's like the slave voices, structurally we only hear their voices in part 2, and the book itself are divided into part 1 and part 2. And then Eddie and Betsy Barron, who are kind of like the lowest members of society, they kind of blur these social constructions, and the Bardo blurs the social constructions because they're in a mass grave with the slaves, and they actually defend some of the slaves, like Elson. They actually stick up for him, and he's like, he's one of them, but he's our friend. And yeah, and just sort of that idea of that similar social position that is created. And for my conclusion, I basically just summarised everything, and that was Unpacking Text. I actually really enjoyed the challenge of it, and hopefully it went okay. Anyway, if anyone's watched this, thank you, and feel free to leave comments below. Bye.